Today I'm going to continue with my reading of The Undiscovered Self by C.G. Jung. This was a series of essays that Dr. Jung published late in his life. They do not have the same prodigious scholarship that the other essays that he wrote throughout his life do have. So they're not hundreds of footnotes and that sort of thing, but they do read well, and it's useful to understand what he was saying. And so today I'm going to be reading Chapter 5, The Philosophical and the Psychological Approach to Life. I just want to check one thing here on the setup. Okay, I think we're alive, and so I'm reading Chapter 5 to The Undiscovered Self by C.G. Jung, The Philosophical and the Psychological Approach to Life. Our ideas have, however, the unfortunate but inevitable tendency to lag behind the changes in the total situation. They can hardly do otherwise, because so long as nothing changes in the world, they remain more or less adapted, and therefore function in a satisfactory way. There is then no cogent reason why they should be changed and adapted anew. Only when conditions have altered so drastically that there is an unendurable rift between the outer situation and our ideas, now become antiquated, does the general problem of our worldview or philosophy of life arise, and with it the question of how the primordial images that maintain the flow of instinctive energy are to be reoriented or readapted. They cannot simply be replaced by a new rational configuration, for this would be molded too much by the outer situation, and not enough by man's biological needs. Moreover, not only would it build no bridge to the original man, but it would block the approach to him altogether. This is in keeping with the aims of Marxist education, which seeks, like God himself, to mold man, but in the image of the state. Today, our basic convictions have become increasingly rationalistic. Our philosophy is no longer a way of life, as it was in antiquity. It has turned into an exclusively intellectual and academic affair. Our denominational religions, with their archaic rites and conceptions, justified enough in themselves, express a view of the world which caused no great difficulties in the Middle Ages, but has become strange and unintelligible to the man of today. Despite this conflict with the modern scientific outlook, a deep instinct bids him hang on to ideas which, if taken literally, leave out of account all the mental developments of the last 500 years. The obvious purpose of this is to prevent him from falling into the abyss of nihilistic despair. But even when, as rationalists, we feel impelled to criticize contemporary religion as literalistic, narrow-minded, and obsolescent, we should never forget that the creeds proclaim a doctrine whose symbols, although their interpretation may be disputed, nevertheless possess a life of their own on account of their archetypal character. Consequently, intellectual understanding is by no means indispensable in all cases, but is called for only when evaluation through feeling and intuition does not suffice. That is to say, with people for whom the intellect holds the prime power of conviction. Hello, Jonas. Welcome. Jonas asked the question, could the approach be called the physiological approach to life, as reason isn't the faculty used to live morally? I find it's more located in the body. I think this is essentially what Dr. Jung is talking about here. Dr. Jung wanted to connect up the instincts and the primeval man to our intellectual way of living today. And because if you do everything in an intellectual way, then it doesn't connect with your instincts, and you ignore it at some point. I mean, it builds up in bad ways, but in any case, reading on, page 73. Nothing is more characteristic and symptomatic in this respect than the gulf that is opened out between faith and knowledge. The contrast has become so enormous that one is obliged to speak of the incommensurability of these two categories and their way of looking at the world. And yet they are concerned with the same empirical world in which we live. For even theology tells us that faith is supported by the facts that become historically perceptible in this known world of ours, namely, that Christ was born as a real human being, worked many miracles, and suffered his fate, died under Pontius Pilate, and rose up in the flesh after his death. Theology rejects any tendency to take the statements of its earlier records as written myths, and accordingly to understand them symbolically. Indeed, it is the theologians themselves who have recently made the attempt, no doubt as a concession to knowledge, to demythologize the object of their faith while drawing the line quite arbitrarily at the crucial points. But to the critical intellect, it is only too obvious that myth is an integral component of all religions and therefore cannot be excluded from the assertions of faith without injuring them. The rupture between faith and knowledge is a symptom of the split consciousness, which is so characteristic of the mental disorder of our day. It is as if two different persons were making statements about the same thing, each from his own point of view, or as if one person in two different frames of mind were sketching a picture of his experience. If for person we substitute modern society, it is evident that the latter is suffering from a mental dissociation, i.e., a neurotic disturbance. In view of this, it does not help matters at all if one party pulls obstinately to the right and the other to the left. This is what happens in every neurotic psyche, to its own deep distress, and it is just this distress that brings the patient to the doctor. As I stated above in all brevity, while not neglecting to mention certain practical details whose omission might have perplexed the reader, the doctor has to establish a relationship with both halves. The doctor has to establish a relationship with both halves of his patient's personality, because only from them both, and not merely from one half with the suppression of the other, can he put together a whole and complete man. The latter alternative is what the patient has been doing all along, for the modern worldview gives him no other guidance. His individual situation is the same in principle as the collective situation. It is a social microcosm, reflecting on the smallest scale the quantities of society at large. or, conversely, as the smallest social unit, cumulatively producing the collective dissociation. The latter possibility is the more likely one, as the only direct and concrete carrier of life is the individual personality, while society and the state are conventional ideas and can claim reality only insofar as they are represented by a certain number of individuals. Marx says, so more testic yin-yang look at logic and faith feeling based arguments. Carl Jung wise, haven't read much of his work, but heard bits and pieces of it. You're saying, so more Taoistic yin-yang look at logic and faith. I think that the significance here, Mark, is that you need both sides of the yin-yang symbol. Just as you do in a marriage, there has to be a bridge between the two sides. The old saw, if a man speaks in the desert and no woman hears him, is he still wrong? Well, yes, he is, but the same applies to the woman. If a woman speaks in the desert and no man hears her, is she still wrong? And the answer is yes, she is. But what Dr. Jung is saying is that the doctor needs to make a connection between the two. And if we're going to have a strong, let's say, vital society in which we're not at each other's throats all the time, then we as citizens have to find ways of connecting to both sides of our political divide, both the blue and the red. All right, reading on. Far too little attention has been paid to the fact that our age, for all its irreligiousness, is hereditarily burdened with the specific achievement of the Christian epic. Is hereditarily burdened with the specific achievement of the Christian epic, the supremacy of the Word, of the Logos, which stands for the central figure of our Christian faith. The Word has literally become our God, and so it has remained, even if we know of Christianity only from hearsay. Words like society and state are so concretized that they are almost personified. In the opinion of the man in the street, the state, far more than any king in history, is the inexhaustible giver of all good. The state is invoked, made responsible, grumbled at, and so on and so forth. Society is elevated to the rank of a supreme ethical principle. Indeed, it is credited with positively creative capacities. No one seems to notice that the veneration of the Word, which was necessary for a certain phase of historical development, has a perilous shadow side. That is to say, the moment the Word, as a result of centuries of education, attains universal validity, it severs its original link with the divine person. There is then a personified church, a personified state. Believe in the Word becomes credulity, and the Word itself an infernal slogan capable of any deception. With credulity come propaganda and advertising to dupe the citizen with political jobbery and compromises, and the lie reaches proportions never known before in the history of the world. Thus, the Word, originally announcing the unity of all men and their union in the figure of the one great man, has in our day become the source of suspicion and distrust of all against all. Credulity is one of our worst enemies, But that is the makeshift the neurotic always resorts to in order to quell the doubter in his own breast or conjure him out of existence. People think you have only to tell a person that he ought to do something in order to put him on the right track. But whether he can or will do it is another matter. The psychologist has come to see that nothing is achieved by telling, persuading, admonishing, giving good advice. He must also get acquainted with the details and have an authentic knowledge of the psychic inventory of his patient. He is therefore to relate to the individuality of the sufferer and feel his way into all the nooks and crannies of his mind to a degree that far exceeds the capacity of a teacher or even of a directeur de conscience, a director of conscience. His scientific objectivity, which excludes nothing, enables him to see his patient not only as a human being, but also as a subhuman who is bound to his body like an animal. The development of science has directed his interest beyond the range of the conscious personality of the world of unconscious instinct dominated by sexuality and the power drive, or self-assertion, corresponding to the twin moral concepts of St. Augustine, concupiscentia and superbia. The clash between these two fundamental instincts, preservation of the species and self-preservation, is the source of numerous conflicts. They are, therefore, the chief object of moral judgment, whose purpose it is to prevent these instinctual collisions as far as possible. Robert says, thanks again for sharing this content. You are helping others to individuate, my friend. I hope so. I hope I'm helping myself to individuate. As I explained above, instinct has two main aspects. On the one hand, that of dynamism, drive, or drift, and on the other hand, specific meaning and intention. It is highly probable that all man's psychic functions have an instinctual foundation, as is obviously the case with animals. It is easy to see that in animals, instinct functions as the spiritus rector of all their behavior. Thus, observation lacks certainty only where the learning capacity begins to develop, for instance, in the higher apes and in man. In the animals, as a result of their learning capacity, instinct undergoes numerous modifications and differentiations. In civilized man, the instincts are so split up that only a few of the basic ones can be recognized with any certainty in their original form. The most important are the two fundamental instincts and their derivatives, and these have been the exclusive concern of medical psychology so far. Investigators found, however, that in following up the ramifications of the instincts, they hit upon configurations which could not, with certainty, be ascribed to either group. To take but one example, the discoverer of the power instinct was in some doubt as to whether an apparently indubitable expression of the sexual instinct might not be better explained as a power arrangement. He's talking about Adler, I believe, here. And Freud himself felt obliged to acknowledge the existence of ego instincts in addition to the overriding sex instinct, a clear concession to the Adlerian standpoint. In view of this uncertainty, it is hardly surprising that in most cases neurotic symptoms can be explained almost without contradiction in terms of either theory. This perplexity does not mean that one or the other standpoint, or both of them, is erroneous. Rather, they are both relatively valid, and unlike certain one-sided and dogmatic preferences, allow the existence and competition of other instincts. Although, as I have said, the question of human instinct is a far from simple matter, we shall probably not be wrong in assuming that the learning capacity, a quality almost exclusive to man, is based on the instinct for imitation found in animals. It is in the nature of this instinct to disturb other instinctive activities and eventually to modify them, as can be observed, for instance, in the songs of birds when they adopt other melodies. Nothing estranges man more from the ground plan of his instincts than his learning capacity, which turns out to be a genuine drive towards progressive transformations of human modes of behavior. It, more than anything else, is responsible for the altered conditions of our existence and the need for new adaptations which civilization brings. It is also the source of numerous psychic disturbances and difficulties occasioned by man's progressive alienation from his instinctual foundation, i.e., by his uprootedness and identification with his conscious knowledge of himself, by his concern with consciousness at the expense of the unconscious. The result is that modern man can know himself only insofar as he can become conscious of himself, a capacity largely dependent on environmental conditions, the drive for knowledge and control of which necessitated or suggested certain modifications of his original instinctive tendencies. His consciousness, therefore, orients itself chiefly by observing and investigating the world around him, and it is to its peculiarities that he must adapt his psychic and technical resources. This task is so exacting and its fulfillment so advantageous that he forgets himself in the process, losing sight of his instinctual nature and putting his own conception of himself in place of his real being. In this way, he slips imperceptibly into a purely conceptual world where the products of his conscious activity progressively replace reality. Separation from his instinctual nature inevitably plunges civilized man into the conflict between conscious and unconscious, spirit and nature, knowledge and faith, a split that becomes pathological the moment his consciousness is no longer able to neglect and suppress his instinctual side. The accumulation of individuals who have got into this critical state starts off a mass movement purporting to be the champion of the suppressed, in accordance with the prevailing tendency of consciousness to seek the source of all ills in the outside world. The cry goes up for political and social changes, which, it is supposed, would automatically solve the much deeper problem of split personality. Hence it is that whenever this demand is fulfilled, political and social conditions arise which bring the same ills back again in altered form. What then happens is a simple reversal. The underside comes to the top, and the shadow takes the place of the light. And since the former is always anarchic and turbulent, the freedom of the liberated underdog must The freedom of the liberated underdog must suffer draconian curtailment. All this is unavoidable because the root of the evil is untouched, and merely the counterposition has come to light. The communist revolution has debased man far lower than democratic collective psychology has done, because it robs him of his freedom, not only in the social, but in the moral and spiritual sense. Aside from the political difficulties, the West has suffered a great psychological disadvantage that made itself unpleasantly felt even in the days of German Nazism. The existence of a dictator allows us to point the finger away from ourselves and at the shadow. He is clearly on the other side of the political frontier, while we are on the side of good and enjoy the possession of the right ideal. Did not a well-known statesman recently confess that he had no imagination for evil? In the name of the multitude, he was here giving expression to the fact that Western man is in danger of losing his shadow altogether, of identifying himself with his fictive personality, and of identifying the world with the abstract picture painted by scientific rationalism. His spiritual and moral opponent, who is just as real as he is, no longer dwells in his own breast, but beyond the geographical line of division, which no longer represents an outward political barrier, but splits off the consciousness from the unconscious man more and more menacingly. Thinking and feeling lose their inner polarity, and where religious orientation has grown ineffective, not even a god is at hand to check the sovereign sway of unleashed psychic functions. Martin says, seek all ills sounds like ENFP personalities with their champion nature. Well, it may sound that way, but I think Dr. Jung was an IN. I think his primary type was INT, J, I think, probably J, because he was so precise about his scholarship. And Andrew Cummins says, I find guilt to be a powerful force that drives me into ruins, but still nonetheless I hear the voice that tries to usher me toward what is better, if that makes sense. Well, it certainly made sense to Michael Cohen yesterday when he was pleading with the judge for his freedom. He was certainly talking about his inner voice. Okay, now where am I? Our rational psychology does not bother itself with whether the other person in us, pejoratively described as the shadow, is in sympathy with our conscious plans and intentions. Evidently, it does not know that we carry in ourselves a real shadow whose existence is grounded in our instinctual nature. The dynamism and imagery of the instincts together form an a priori which no man can overlook without the gravest risk to himself. Violation or neglect of instinct has painful consequences of a physiological and psychological nature, for whose removal medical help above all is required. Wonder what he was talking about. Yeah, I'm right. So Mark says the shadow normally characterizes something that deeply loads a part of humanity, but what about the shadow that loves humanity regardless whether humanity loves it back, not a singular person, just the concept of humans. Well, I agree that there are both types, and we need to be conscious of both the good and the bad. For more than 50 years, we have known, or could have known, that there is an unconscious as a counterbalance to consciousness. Medical psychology has furnished all the necessary empirical and experimental proofs of this. Now, more than 100 years, not 50 years. There is an unconscious psychic reality which demonstrably influences consciousness and its contents. All this is known, but no practical conclusions have been drawn from it. We still go on thinking and acting as before, as if we were simplex and not duplex. Accordingly, we imagine ourselves to be innocuous, reasonable, and humane. We do not think of distrusting our motives or of asking ourselves how the inner man feels about the things we do in the outside world. But actually, it is frivolous, superficial, and unreasonable of us, as well as psychically unhygienic, to overlook the reaction and standpoint of the unconscious. One can regard one's stomach or heart as unimportant and worthy of contempt, but that does not prevent overeating or overextension from having consequences that affect the whole man. Yet we think that psychic mistakes and their consequences can be got rid of with mere words, for psychic means less than air to most people. All the same, nobody can deny that without the psyche, there would be no world at all, and still less a human world. Virtually everything depends on the human soul and its functions. It should be worthy of all the attention we can give it, especially today, when everyone admits that the weal and woe of the future will be decided neither by the attacks of wild animals, nor by natural catastrophes, nor by the danger of worldwide epidemics, but simply and solely by the psychic changes in man. It needs only an almost imperceptible disturbance of equilibrium in a few of our rulers' heads to plunge the world into blood, fire, and radioactivity. The technical means necessary for this are present on both sides, and certain conscious deliberations uncontrolled by any inner opponent can be indulged in all too easily, as we have seen already from the example of one leader. The consciousness of modern man still clings so much to outward objects that he makes them exclusively responsible, as if it were them that the decision depended, as if it were on them that the decision depended. That the psychic state of certain individuals could emancipate itself for once from the behavior of objects is something that is considered far too little, although irrationalities of this sort are observed every day and can happen to everyone. The forlornness of consciousness in our world is due primarily to the loss of instinct, and the reason for this lies in the development of the human mind over the past eon. The more power man had over nature, the more his knowledge and skill went to his head, and the deeper became his contempt for the merely natural and accidental, for that which is irrationally given, including the objective psyche, which is all that consciousness is not. In contrast to the subjectivism of the conscious mind, the unconscious is objective, manifesting itself mainly in the form of contrary feelings, fantasies, emotions, impulses, and dreams, none of which one makes oneself, but which come up none of which one makes oneself, but which come upon one objectively. Even today, psychology is still, for the most part, the science of conscious contents, measured as far as possible by collective standards. The individual psyche has become a mere accident, a random phenomenon, while the unconscious, which can manifest itself only in the real, irrationally given human being, has been ignored altogether. This was not the result of carelessness or of a lack of knowledge, but of downright resistance to the mere possibility of there being a second psychic authority besides the ego. It seems a positive menace to the ego that its monarchy can be doubted. The religious person, on the other hand, is accustomed to the thought of not being sole master in his own house. He believes that God, and not he himself, decides in the end. But how many of us would dare to let the will of God decide? And which of us would not feel embarrassed if he had to say how far the decision came from God himself? The religious person, so far as one can judge, stands directly under the influence of the reaction from the unconscious. As a rule, he calls this the operation of conscience. But since the same psychic background produces reactions other than moral ones, the believer is measuring his conscience by the traditional ethical standard and thus by a collective value, in which endeavor he is assiduously supported by his church. So long as the individual can hold fast to his traditional beliefs and the circumstances of his time do not demand stronger emphasis on individual autonomy, he can rest content with the situation. But the situation is radically altered when the worldly-minded man who is oriented to external factors and has lost his religious beliefs appears en masse. As in the case today, the believer is then forced onto the defensive. And must catechize himself on the foundation of his beliefs. He is no longer sustained by the tremendous subjective power of the consensus omnium. That's the general consensus, I think. I'll read that sentence again. He is no longer sustained by the tremendous subjective power of the consensus omnium, and is keenly aware of the weakening of the church and of the precariousness of its dogmatic assumptions. To counter this, the church recommends more faith, as if this gift of grace depended on man's goodwill and pleasure. The seat of faith, however, is not consciousness, but spontaneous religious experience, which brings the individual's faith into immediate relation with God. Here we must ask, have I any religious experience and immediate relation to God, and hence that certainty which will keep me as an individual from dissolving in the crowd? Okay. So that completes chapter 5. I will hopefully tomorrow read chapter 6 at some point. And chapter 6 is entitled Self-Knowledge. Let me just look back at your comments. Eric says, and what about the act of seeking out negotiations, ones with one's own shadow instead of a thought pattern that characterize good and bad? Well, if you can do that in active imagination or something, that is a worthwhile thing to do. I think there are very few people who can actually negotiate with their shadow, but if you can do it, it's a great thing. And Oliver says, for God all things are good and fair and just, for man, some things are good and some things are not. Well, this is a debate that we have been having on this channel for some weeks now, which I think that the way you're presenting this is based on the Christian conception, which came up over 2,000 years, of the privatio boni. And I noted in the last general meeting, which was 2 videos ago, or maybe 1 video ago, that Dr. Ann Ulanoff, in her books, and let's see, do I have them right here? I don't. But she noted that she felt that Dr. Jung had fallen for the devil's trick, and so let's all understand what the devil's trick is so that we don't fall into this trick. Dr. Jung basically stayed in his lane, the psychology lane, and his reasoning, I believe, after reading a lot of his work, multiple times I might add, is that he was being attacked by theologians who didn't want their rice bowl overcooked or their boat rocked, and psychologists who psychology took a materialistic turn when it followed Freud, which is the rationalistic side of the ledger, but it failed to take account of the irrational side of the coin, the eros side, which is life. And so we could say very simply that the Holy Bible is, it's the Logos, and it's just a black book with a lot of words in it, unless you bring it into your life. And in order to do that, you have to have eros, you have to have some irrational factor which makes the Bible come alive for you. And so Dr. Ulanoff's point was that theologians have a point of view too, and that Dr. Jung should have been better at building a bridge between the two. He was a kind of shock jock of his time, I think, because if you look at Answer to Job, paragraph 752, he made the statement that every religious statement of whatever kind, and he was including with that whatever religion, every religious statement is a statement of the psyche. It's not a statement of the physis, that is, of the physical world. And so, yes, that is true. If you think about it, his point was if it was from the physical world, then it would be covered in the textbooks of natural science, which it is not. And so that's quite a realization when you come to it, if you've been raised as a Christian or in any other faith, to all of a sudden realize that you're not talking about the physical world at all when you're talking about religion. You're talking about the psychological world, the psychic world. And so that's quite a wake-up call for lots of people. But Dr. Jung didn't make it easy. And so when he said that, he lost his relationship, which had developed over a decade, with Father Victor White. Father White was extremely critical of Answer to Job. I actually have not read Father White's critical review. I haven't found it yet, but I will do at some point. And so the point is we need both. We need the psychological perspective and we need the theological perspective, because there's a lot of truths in what emerged organically within all religions over the last 4,000 or 5,000 years, let's say. And so they do contain a lot of truths, and we need to appreciate what those truths are, because they can save us from ourselves. And so we do have to, as Dr. Jung pointed out, we each have to make our own judgments about what is moral and what is not. And that has to include within it where we are as instinctual beings, because we're all instinctual beings. Oliver says, I fully agree mythological ideas do not relate to historical events, but spiritual events. Yes, spiritual events. But we have many Christian pastors who are running around the world saying, every word in the Bible is absolutely true. And Dr. Jung would say, yes, it's absolutely true, but they're not true in the physical world. They're true in the psychological world. And that's the big divide that has to be bridged, I think. And this is the point that Dr. Jung is trying to make here as well, I think. I have to admit, I came up into my 60s before I came upon this particular paragraph of Answer to Job, and I said, whoa, yeah, that's right. And it was after having certain visionary experiences myself, so I started to grok it. You have to have a religious experience before you really appreciate what religion is doing for you. So I'm honored to have so many people listening. Are there other thoughts or questions before I log off this session? Sean says, I had a weird dream last night where I met God in a white asymmetrical hallway with off-center door frames, and he told me the devil is out and sent me flying back. And well, that's an interesting dream, John. I won't comment on it because I have a policy of not commenting on the dreams of others. But I do think it's a very interesting dream, and it's one that you should think about and think what it means to you. Obviously these symbols have unique meanings to each one of us, as we've discussed before. A book of symbols or dream symbols doesn't help you at all, because anybody can make a symbol out of anything, and you just don't know what a specific symbol is going to mean. So all the books they sell down at Barnes & Noble about dreams, the meaning of dreams and interpretation of dreams, they're just doorstops. Let's see, what else do we have here? Oliver says, I've been dreaming of water lately, and water in the dreams has been getting shallower and shallower. Last night, only my feet were in the water, and I was looking for Thor, God, I am assuming. Okay, well, within the context of Jungian psychology, water often refers to the unconscious, and so I wouldn't, since I'm not a mental health professional, I'm not going to opine on what that image means. Other than that, you know, whether it's good or bad, you have to decide that for yourself. Britt Elias says, just here to thank you. Finding your channel has in fact changed my life. Wow, I appreciate that. I mean, finding Dr. Jung's work did in fact change my life in many ways over the last 3 decades. And it's especially because of my personal gratitude about that fact that I do this channel, because I think it can help others, and I think Dr. Jung's thinking can help others. I do not think that Dr. Jung's thinking is the end-all be-all. I mean, that needs to be developed much more. As he said himself in his interview with the BBC, which you can find on YouTube here, he said, we know no thing. He didn't say it as nothing. He said, we know no thing about the psyche. And this is the man who wrote 20 books about what we do know historically about the psyche, and who was one of the major archetypes of the whole psychological movement and psychiatric movement of the 20th century. And so the way I take that is that there is much, much more research that needs to be done. The issue is that in the psyche, we don't solve for X. You can't create an experiment and say, I'm going to hold all the other variables constant and I'm going to solve for this one thing, because the psyche doesn't work that way. The psychic facts are all very complex, as any dream is very complex, for example. And so what Dr. Edinger pointed out to us is that every paragraph in Dr. Jung's work, and basically this is true of any of his works, although he was specifically referring to the book Ion, but every paragraph represents a psychic fact, and some of these psychic facts go on for 2 pages. And so a psychic fact is more like a cheese ball that you might have at Christmas time that has many contents in it. Think of it that way. And you have to get to the essence of it, but that's what inner reflection does, and that's what both Dr. Jung and Dr. Edinger were encouraging us to do. So thank you for your comment, Britt. I appreciate it very much. It seems I do have a following of people who find what I've done helpful, and that keeps me going, and I appreciate it quite a lot. So any other comments? And so if you're not a member of our advanced reading group, I would urge you to join us on Mondays at it's not Mondays, it's Wednesdays at 1:30. We have one more seminar session next Wednesday before the Christmas holiday. Then we'll be taking 3 weeks off. But if you're not already in the system, there's plenty to find there, because the advanced reading group has its own Dropbox, which is separate from our general Dropbox. And in that Dropbox, the advanced group Dropbox, there is the entire seminar that I've done on Ion. We're now in the last chapter of Ion. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll quite finish the book before the Christmas holiday, but almost. And so there's a lot to learn in those seminar sessions that we've already done. There's 27 of them, and each one is 2 hours long. So you can see that it's a very long piece of work. Let's see, 54 hours. So it's, roughly equivalent to a graduate level seminar. And unfortunately, I don't give credits. I don't have credits to give, but anyway, you're welcome to join us. Britt says, we know nothing about the psyche. As you've said before, exploring his work is like dealing with an elephant. I'm grateful for the guidance, and even if his work is an incomplete cheese ball of goo. Well, there's lots of research to be done, and Dr. Jung once made a comment about the self, that being in the vicinity of the self, or the God image, as he described it, which is the deepest archetype in the unconscious. He says even being in the vicinity of the self is like walking in the middle of a herd of elephants. So there's the elephant connection. Thank you, Britt. Thanks for reminding me about the Vance reading group, what will come after Ion. Lately, we've been discussing the possibility of going into psychology and alchemy, because, and if you're not familiar with psychology and alchemy, is volume, I don't know, maybe volume 12 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. I have to remind myself, because I don't keep remembering what the volume numbers are. Let's see. Yeah, Psychology and Alchemy is volume 12, and basically I've read it before, and it amounts to the history of the development of the human mind for the last 3,000 years. So it's a very interesting book. But, the basic idea in alchemy and in alchemical psychology is that there is a vase, a cauldron, let's say, or a bowl, a cooking pot, into which we put ingredients, psychic ingredients, and those produce a result. And so I had a mentor at one time who said that every time he added a person to a group, or a person dropped out of a group, it changed the group. And so this is also true of you. Every time you add something to your psychological knowledge, or subtract it, or ignore it, or choose it to say that it's wrong, everything that you put into your psyche and take out of your psyche one way or another, either by suppression or repression perhaps, changes you. And this is the sort of the fundamental idea that Dr. Jung was discovering in alchemy. And so Ion discusses this at length, and we've already been through those parts, but it is in the videos of these seminars we've done. And so Psychology and Alchemy will continue on with that. And then the big book that he did at the end was called Mysterium Conjunctionis. That was his last major work. That's volume 14 of the collected works. And that is a major tome, which I will undertake in the advanced group at some point, because it does have an excellent commentary that goes with it that Edward Edinger did. So, but anyway, the short answer to your question is, so far we haven't definitely decided what's next, but in principle, what's next is psychology and alchemy. And so Oliver says, thank you very much for this channel. You're welcome. And Britt says, yes. And Sean says, what do you think God's true intention for Cain was in Cain and Abel? By using that expression, Sean, it implies that God is an intentional being that treats you like a puppeteer might treat you. And that is not the way Dr. Jung saw God, and it's not the way I see God. And so I'll give you Dr. Jung's definition of God here for simplicity. It appears, Dr. Edinger put it in Encounters with the Self, which is his book about the book of Job and about the William Blake etchings of the book of Job. But his definition, which he was quoting Dr. Jung, God is the name by which I designate all things which cross my willful path violently and recklessly, all things which upset my subjective views, plans, and intentions, and change the course of my life for better or for worse, unquote. And that was carried in Good Housekeeping magazine in December of 1961. And, if you think about the things in your life that have happened for better or for worse, that weren't part of your plan, those are acts of God, okay? And God, as Job observed 500 years before Christ, God doesn't have only a good side. God has two sides. God has a good side and a bad side. And so Dr. Jung pointed out that Job, in the book of Job in the Bible, decided he would negotiate with the good side. And so in terms of Cain and Abel, they were, the result of the way human beings behave with one another. When did Cain and Abel live? Maybe 3,500 years ago. They're a continuation of a long line of development. And so I think of God as God's way of deciding good and evil by, I facetiously call it bumper cars, which is different people's attitudes pound together, and what emerges from that over time, and I mean by emerges from the whole of humanity, that becomes the good side of God. But it's a very bloody process, and so we can point to it. I can point to it in terms of the United States, because here we have every type of human being that exists in the world. We have every race, every cultural group, every religion, and we're all Americans. And in the end, it works very well, but we have clashed over the centuries, and from those clashes, we force out the impurities and we keep the good things. And so other countries don't allow the kinds of debates that we have, and they get left behind. And so if we want to look at the will of God is manifested by the way we live in the United States, I think. And it's still in process most other places, unfortunately. You know, to a certain extent, Western Europe and Japan fill that need, but you know, in certain countries that seem to be very well advanced over a period of time, often then fall behind because they haven't adopted the best ideas of humanity. So Britt asks, will it begin in mid-January? Yes, I think so. And Sean says, there is a theory that God has his one psychological development and he learned along the way. And I would say that that is a continuing psychological development. I think Dr. Jung believed that human consciousness was God becoming conscious of himself and of his creation. Because if he went up on Mount Elgon in Africa one time, and he looked down over the plateau where all the herds of different types of animals were, and you know, the lions were doing their thing and the gazelles were doing their thing and so on. And he realized that before human consciousness came to that site, that process had been going on for hundreds of millions of years. And so it's not necessarily a very efficient process, but as we've become more conscious, obviously, gazelles became conscious of the fact instinctually that they were the prey of the lions over a long period of evolution. Now that we have consciousness, we can work out things much more efficiently, I think. So Sean says, if God is all-powerful, he could make something as complex as himself in theory. You know, I don't want to rule out the metaphysical God, because I think there is a driving force within us, okay, in the same sense as in Star Wars, may the force be with you. And that force is causing us to come to consciousness. And we come to consciousness by clashes. The clashes, the blood that is spilt, causes us to become more conscious. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if we take election 2016, certainly Democrats became more conscious of the fact that they had failed the Rust Belt, which was their bread and butter, their natural constituency over several decades. You know, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, part of Illinois too, Pennsylvania, had been, and maybe also West Virginia, those states had all been in Democratic constituency. But what Donald Trump probably intuitively understood is that the Democrats had not paid attention enough to their own natural constituency, and so he capitalized on that. And so that's how we become conscious, because because there's a clash, and you lose, and you have to go back and figure out what you did wrong. So if you're part of the Democratic Party, you definitely know that you have some healing to do in those Rust Belt states. And if you're a member of the Republican Party, you have some delivery to do in those Rust Belt states, because there seem to be still losing jobs in many of the cities in that part of the world. And so the question is, who will become conscious enough of how to help our fellow Americans who live in those states? That's the question. So Britt says, wonderful. Thank you, Skip. You and your work are so appreciated. Thank you. I appreciate that very much. Okay, so we've been here an hour and 10 minutes. I think I'm going to terminate at this point, and I will try, never say try, because then that means you won't do something. There are 2 more chapters to this book. One is called SelfKnowledge, Chapter 6, and Chapter 7 is the meaning of self-knowledge. And I've been reading from The Undiscovered Self by C.G. Jung. I intend to read those other 2 chapters within the next couple of days, so that there will be a complete audio version of this for you to listen to. I don't expect people to stare at their video screen and watch me. I don't think my talking head is of that much value. But but I have always found that audiobooks are extremely helpful to me, because I can use them when driving and so on, and I've learned so much from them, from audio books. And so I'm intending this as something that you can listen to, at least for our subscribers. And it is a closed group, which allows me to read it to you in the context of American fair use under the copyright law, because we are closed group and you are volunteering to want me to read it to you. But it's a rapidly growing closed group, which is going to approach 3,000 subscribers very soon. So anyway, nice to see you today. I probably will be online at some point tomorrow to do Chapter 6. So thank you for joining today.